Hello, welcome to Taxpayer Alert. I'm Al Segalla. I'll be your moderator for the show. I'm also president of the Calaveras County Taxpayer Association. And like all our shows, we have some experts, and you'll learn things here you'll not know, you'll never learn elsewhere. And since this show is no exception, our guest is Albert Alt, who's our county CEO. Albert, welcome.
Hello, sir.
How did you get into this business of being our CEO in our county?
Well, that's been an interesting path. Prior to being here, I spent almost 2 decades in higher education as an executive. And education's obviously a different form of public service. It has its own culture and a little bit different than local government. But I spent the majority of my career while it was in higher education, it was in human resources and finance. And at the end of the day, working for public entities, HR is guided by the same laws in virtually all of our public entities. Finance, pretty much the same in all public entities. So there was a lot of parallels from the work that I had prior to coming to the county. But probably most importantly, what brought me to the job and my interest in the job is I live in the county. My kids go to school here. My wife and I have chosen to make our home in Calaveras County prior to being here for the work. And so I felt very attached to serving the county. I'd been on some commissions and had experience interacting with the county. And at the end of the day, I guess we get to a certain point in our careers where you feel like you're beyond career advancement and more about the quality of work that you can do and the effect that you can have. And it felt like I had, and hopefully will prove this, that I had tools in my toolbox that would help the county and our magnificent employees, and certainly the rewards of serving our public is a value that I just didn't even really realize how impactful that was going to be for me.
I've been going to Board of Supervisors meetings for 10 years now on behalf of the Taxpayer Association, and I got to say, you're the most organized person I ever met.
Well, we try. I won't take credit for all of that. As you know, just like this production, there's people who are sitting up front presenting. But at the end of the day, again, just like this production, there's a lot of people behind the scenes that do a lot of heavy lifting and a lot of work that contribute. So everything that I do in my work ultimately is a team effort. And we've got a lot of great people there at the county, and I have a lot of support. So I get the benefit of being in front of the presentations, but at the end of the day, there's really good people that are helping support that work. And you have experience with many of them and have watched them yourself.
We've got a very high quality Board of Supervisors, even though they don't agree with each other all the time. And everybody I met with the county has been just super. It's kind of a real pleasure to be involved with it. Yeah. So one of the major things, of course, is handling money. You're in charge of that. And so now you're looking at the mid-year budget. And tell us a little bit about what's going to happen with that.
Well, so the mid-year budget, with any budget, somewhere around 50% through is the best opportunity for you to look at what did you plan for revenues. Are they tracking? It's not exactly true that at 50% through the year we would have 50% of our revenues, right. But it's as close to a good opportunity for us to be able to measure what we plan for. As you know, we have major sources of revenue or property tax, sales tax, but we also have a lot of revenue from the state as well. So it's a good opportunity for us to measure whether or not our revenues are tracking with what we anticipated when we put the budget forward.
Now, if the revenues are higher than expectations, does that mean the taxpayers get a refund?
No, it doesn't necessarily. But what it will help us do is, and following the board meeting, it's obviously very important that we have contingencies and reserves, and also plan on additional programming, or look at areas where we need to shore up our services. So that'll be the exercise. If we have additional revenue, depending on how much it is, we'll look at where that additional revenue should end up landing. In this year's budget, we took a pretty good hit. At my recommendation, we reduced our contingencies and our reserves to backstop some of the challenges we had in the disaster budgets that we have. So I would think that our first priority, and I committed this when we brought the budget forward, is that if we do have additional revenue, that we backstop that which we had to address in contingencies and reserve first, and then we can look at other places where we may make expenditures.
It seems like quite often we declare an emergency in order to get funds from the state or the federal government. And I'm wondering if that system can be improved to be a little bit more responsible, where we can have our own insurance, or we being the county, have our own insurance, or even a reserve that's put aside for what we know is going to be every year. There's going to be fires and whatnot.
Well, there's a couple reasons for us to declare an emergency, and that's not only for reimbursement from the state. We have different opportunities under the codes if there's an emergency and it's been declared on how we procure things. For example, if we have a major road emergency or weather damages to roads and we declare an emergency, we can take different actions to respond to that emergency. So that's one reason. Second reason certainly is then if there is any state or federal funding that we're able to access those funds. At the end of the day, when you combine three different governmental entities, from local government, state government, which we have to interact with, Cal OES when we declare, and then of course we have FEMA as well. If there's a way to streamline those three different bureaucracies, I'm not aware of it yet, but I think if you and I can figure that out, we'll do well on our roadshow.
I think so. Well, taxpayers have a little different viewpoint sometimes, and we kind of look at the bottom line. Okay, the government takes money from people, and then it gives some of the money back. All right, what's the markup on that transaction? Are they taking 10%, 50%, 100%? We don't seem to have the answer to that question, but it seems that the more closely controlled, the money be more closely controlled locally. It still may not be responsible, but it'd be more of a tendency to be more responsible because it's closer to people. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, and I experienced this in the education environment, and it's the same in local government. I think you've seen some of my other presentations that we're a subsidiary of the state,
right?
And we have a lot of the state demand passed on to us, and in some cases it fits with our own strategic planning, and in other cases it's just a demand that's given to us from the state. And oftentimes, in fact, we're in a good economy, and the state has a lot of money, and they're passing monies to our county that we really appreciate.
Right.
But at the same time, sometimes it's almost just as difficult to spend a lot of money when it comes our way as it is to cut. And it was the same on the education side as in local government. We're always asking for more flexibility. We're always asking for local control. We're always asking for those who we elect in our county to have. As we all do, we've all voted for the supervisors that we have, and we trust them to take care of our local interests. So we'll always lobby for additional local control, but again, it comes back to that bureaucracy, and we see this in every change of administration, whether it's federal or state.
Right.
The initiatives, particularly of the state, whatever the will of the governor is, we'll see that translated to us in either one-time monies or grant monies or things of that nature that can always shift when the administration and the state changes, and that's always a concern for us.
We have some organizations that the county belongs to. I think one is CSAC, and there's RC. Yeah. I wonder if those groups, if they agreed, could be of some help in lobbying the state to try to bring more reason to these laws.
They lobby heavily on our behalf. They're both county organizations, both of their advisory boards and or governing boards are appointed by counties, so they're very in tune with what we hope to have, and they influence legislation quite often. But there's always going to be, and there's just, I wish I had a more articulate way to describe it, that our county and our interests may not always align with all of the initiatives in the state. And even when they do, there may be other counties throughout the state where their goals and their initiatives don't necessarily align with an administration. So it's a real challenge to bring 58 counties together and all ask for the same thing, just because of the diversity of our population in our state and frankly the different viewpoints that we have, from our northern border to our southern border.
Like our rural counties are different than the high population counties.
We are much different in many ways, not only in our demographic makeup, but the benefit that we have in natural resources. There's always a challenge between the resources we have and how they're shared. Water's obviously one. I'm not a water expert, but we have a lot of water, and we don't always get to keep that water. So we enjoy natural resources that benefit the rest of the state. And sometimes there's a monetary return for that, and in some cases there's not. Sometimes it's just for the good of the state. And we certainly have our own interests in our county, but they tend to be the same in most rural counties, and they don't always necessarily align with where the funding goes to support major population centers and the infrastructure necessary for those populations.
Now, we lost Rebecca, our auditor, and I think we're going through a process now to find a new one. Is that correct?
That is correct. The board will interview finalists on December 16th.
No, not far away.
No, we've gone through the process. We ran an advertisement. We'll have an internal screening committee that'll put recommendations forward to the board, and then the board will have an open board meeting, and much like what you observed and experienced when they did that for the sheriff's position, it'll be very similar.
Well, that's good. It'd be good to get a good auditor on board.
Yeah.
The auditor is a taxpayer's friend.
Well, we lost a good one. Big shoes to fill, but we hope to replace in kind.
All right, that's good news. So one of the things that we concerned with some emergency repairs that we've had, and this is very serious because we were talking about a jail facility, and the inmates are helpless. If there's a catastrophe, they're they can't go run and hide. They're locked up. So anyway, I understand that's being handled through some emergency measures. Is that correct?
Well, it is, and you were present at the board meetings when we brought those items forward. Unfortunately, and the taxpayers know this, that facility was built on taxpayer bond dollars, and unfortunately now we're getting to the point where we've exercised the building a lot. It's out of warranty, and we've got some mechanical systems that in this case failed. And between our sheriff and our undersheriff and working with our facilities team and our administration, we feel strongly that we're responsible for those that are under our care in that facility, and that's why we brought the emergency request before the board.
Yeah.
If they weren't to approve that emergency, then we have to go through some different procurement processes under the public contract code that could have delayed that project. So we all felt strongly bringing that forward to the board, and clearly the board felt just as strongly about the criticality of it because they voted in the affirmative for us to be able to move forward on an emergency. And at the end of the day, we all understood it was our responsibility to take care of that facility that ultimately provides health and well-being to the inmates there.
Yeah. Now, what went wrong? A boiler broke? Is that?
Well, I'll give you the simple terms because I'm not a facilities person, but essentially a boiler that provides hot water to certain portions of the jail. Now we do have some redundant systems, so we were able to have hot water in parts of the facility, and we were able to make an emergency repair. So we were able to have some hot water, but ultimately the emergency repair was to make sure that we had hot water to the 100% of the facility.
So it's a little more complicated than replacing a water heater.
Well, if you look at it as a water heater, we have several. And so, when the water heater went out, we were able to rely on one of the others. But we still had to make sure that we got the one that went out back in place.
Right.
And so we initially did some, very basic repairs to get it operating, but we knew they wouldn't hold long term. And that's why we went before the board and asked for the emergency repair. And I think the contract was about $30,000 to ultimately make the repair. But we're doing some larger assessments as well, not only on that facility, but hope to do on other facilities to measure what our ongoing increasing costs are going to be to make sure our facilities stay in a good condition, rather than not put money towards facilities and wait till they get more towards the end of life before we put money into them.
You mentioned that the funding came from the state in the way of a grant. Now, how was that? Was that funded with a bond issue, or was that just taken out of the state budget? Where'd that money come from?
You mean on the boiler?
No, for the jail.
The jail was actually a bond issuance. The taxpayers, we asked the taxpayers to vote, and they voted to tax themselves and raised the money through a bond issuance for that. So thank you to the taxpayers for that.
Yeah, you're welcome. We have a great sheriff and a really good jail. I went on a tour there. I was just amazed.
Did you eat while you were there?
No, I didn't eat anything, but I heard the food was good.
I've heard that as well. That the food there is fantastic, and I know that Leadership Calaveras, when they do the tour, they usually eat there as well. And I haven't had an opportunity, but I've heard many brag on it.
When I was a chamber director, I was also on Leadership Calaveras, and just amazing that what I learned when being part of that group. Incredible.
Yeah, that's a good program.
Yeah, and hopefully that'll continue. All right, so next item that the taxpayers are concerned with is power shutdown. And so looks like this is going to continue, and it seems like these power lines are a cause of a significant portion of the annual fires we have. And there's some talk of putting insulation on the wires so that they don't arc. But in the meantime, if it looks like there's a extremely high fire danger with high winds and dry conditions, they shut the power off, and they try to give you notice in advance. And this is what's been happening pretty much. Is that true?
That's true. Our county's experience since the beginning of October, we've been involved with, and when I mean county, I mean our county residents in some shape or form have been involved in 4 public safety power shutdowns, or what we know them as, and you hear at the board meeting as PSPSs now. And I think there's been one that we weren't included in. It happened before our first opportunity to get to test our mettle in a PSPS. But we've learned a lot from them. It's been an interesting experience. PG&E was, I think, pretty prepared, at least in their messaging in the beginning. And we kind of went into the first one thinking that we'd get notice at 72 hours and 48 hours and 24 hours, and then we'd know, what was being shut down and when it was going to come back on. And it felt like it was going to be, pretty well organized. And what we found is for one, Mother Nature is not very predictable.
Yeah.
Any weather event is really hard to keep your hands on that. So we found that was a challenge. But PG&E, frankly, had put quite an effort through the course of the PSPSs in trying to lessen the footprint of the event and keep as many people on as much as possible. So what we learned in the first event, the first big one we had, was that initially the footprint was one size and certain communities would be included, and then we learned their bubble changes through the weather event, and they work really hard to try and minimize it, but it made it a really fluid situation. So one day we might have one set of information, and we're pushing that out to not only the government center but the community as well, communities. and the next day the information would change. And in fact, sometimes it would change. In a PSPS event, PG&E has and OES have 3 informational calls, one at 7:30 in the morning, one at 12:30 in the afternoon, and then 5:30 in the afternoon. And so we would attend all of those calls, and sometimes between 7:30 and 12:30, the footprint of the outage would change, or the length of the outage would change. And it really, we found it really challenging to try and give our community members, our citizens, good information when we're entirely dependent on the information that we were getting from those briefing calls. And I don't begrudge PG&E for shifting the information, but we found it was really hard for our citizens to be able to follow. Am I in the outage or am I not? Shall I prepare, or am I going to be excluded this time? And we felt bad about having to shift that information regularly to our citizens, but we kept them as informed as we could.
I think that they need great improvement in our notification process. We get a call, and they give us a code to go to a website, and they only give it once, and it's a long code, and you can hardly even write it down because it's so confusing. And then so you give up on that, and then you call them. Then they're more helpful if you call them, and then they can't. They can only give you general information that your area is subject to being shut down. Not that it is, or so.
Yeah, you might be in.
You might, yeah. And I think they can improve their telephone information, because they do know the phone numbers geographically, and so they know by calling this bank of numbers for a certain thing, they don't have to refer them to a website.
Back, yeah.
They can say, "Oh, you're a good chance your power's going to turn off, starting such and such time, and we'll call you again with an update." Perfect. That handles it. But it's too simple.
I'll say we and the county folks that were on the calls regularly, myself, John Osborne, and OES, we saw a legitimate effort on behalf of PG&E to try and evolve their program. At the end of the day, I think we thought it was going to be an off-the-shelf program, but as they learned through going through so many PSPSs, they had to morph it a little bit. But we saw each time it got a little better. The communication got better. The stand-up of our community resiliency centers got better, and we tried to make sure we had a really tight relationship with PG&E so we could get those resiliency centers. And ultimately, they ended up being a benefit. We learned some lessons from having them in our communities. We learned a lot from our citizens that used them or weren't able to use them. And we also learned a lot about our relationship with the City of Angels camp as well. We worked very closely with Melissa Eads and her staff there. We attended some of the community meetings and helped distribute information at the CRC at Utica Park. And so we've learned a lot of lessons on how we can, she and I, how we can run government better together. But we also learned a lot about the quality of people that we have throughout our county. We saw many instances of people helping people, and neighbors watching out for neighbors, and businesses helping businesses, and businesses doing what they can to serve their community, even if it didn't benefit their own particular business. And
there was a TV news item in which there was strong protests because their power wasn't turned off. And apparently some of this came from the schools that get paid by the day. So they could have taught this day, and they're denied the money. So they want to get the money if it isn't shut down.
Yeah, we learned some lessons in the first shutdown. We had some of our we were making arrangements with the schools, and Scott Nanick has been a great partner with us. Has been for a long time with the county, but we've been working very closely with him, and hopefully we're going to be able to use the schools. And it made sense when we knew a PSBS was going to start this day and end this day, and we knew the duration, and we knew what was in and what was out. But what we learned with the flexible information coming from PG&E is that since the schools are paid on what's called average daily attendance,
Right.
they're, for obvious reasons, they're motivated to be open, not only because of the way they get paid, but to provide education to our kids. And so an off-the-shelf solution that our power is going to be shut down Monday to Wednesday made sense for us to be able to use schools as resiliency centers. But once the footprint started evolving and the time frame started evolving, we found that by wanting to be on the schools' campuses, especially since they're K-12 campuses, that we can't have the mix of adults and students on the campuses. So our desire to be there was in conflict with the need for our kids to be there and receive education, and then in the means of funding for the schools as well. So it was a great partnership, is a great partnership. We really appreciate Scott and Anik, as many people do. Yeah. But they're probably not the best ongoing in our planning. They're probably not the best place for us to plan to have the resiliencies on school grounds because of that flexibility.
I remember Scott and Anik and I were in Toastmasters together over 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And also, our taxpayer group was promoting the Constitution, and he was helpful with that. He reviewed our little booklet that we were sending out. We didn't get enough donation. We couldn't get a whole program going. It's probably my fault. But anyway, Scott and Anik was really hanging in there. He's a wonderful guy.
Yeah, local hero.
Yeah. So we're looking ahead now. We got 2 minutes. What do you see coming up that we should be concerned about as a taxpayer?
Well, probably, I don't want to, poke at the elephant in the room, but we know, the cannabis issue is one that's very emotional,
right,
to all parties, understandably. So we're going to have the interesting overlay. You mentioned the mid-year budget, and then, throughout the spring, we'll start into budget development for the next year. So we're going to have the interesting overlay with the cannabis ordinance becoming active, the fee studies becoming effective in December, then the mid-year budget, and we're going to have some work commitment for the cannabis program, and then also the really heavy lifting of developing the next year's budget. So that's going to consume a lot of time from an administration perspective. And, that's probably what people can expect coming out of the county is discussion about, the cannabis and the regulatory ordinances and how that's going to be implemented, and then on into budget development in the spring.
Well, you're certainly right about the cannabis issue. It's really, there's a lot of anger and emotion involved with that. One of the things that we promoted, nobody paid attention to us, was to have a sunset. So the regulations would expire after a period of time. But nobody paid attention to us, so we don't have the sunset clause. I'm so happy you're a guest.
Thank you, Al. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you for watching Taxpayer Alert. See you next time.